I want to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting this event. Let me say how delighted I am to be here this evening with Malcolm and Kevin to talk about Richard Wright's extraordinary novel about race in America, about police brutality, and about many other things as well. When publishers brought out posthumous novels of major 20th century authors, too often it's the case, I feel, that these are second or third-rate books, but I want to say very loudly and clearly that that is not the case here. This is a vintage Richard Wright novel. It was written in 1941 and 1942, coming between Richard Wright's two most celebrated books. His first novel, Native Son, published in 1940, and his autobiography, Black Boy, published in 1945, which is only to say, this is Richard Wright working at the very height of his creative powers. And in an essay that he envisioned should accompany his novel, either as a preface or perhaps an afterword, an essay, by the way, which Library of America also includes in its edition, Wright tells us that this novel was more inspired and meant more to him than anything else he had yet written up to that point. Up to that point means his first collection of stories, Uncle Tom's Children, but it also means his most celebrated novel, Native Son. So here's the author telling us that this novel is more important than Native Son. When Richard Wright's agent, a man named Paul Reynolds, submitted the novel in December of 1941 to Wright's publisher, Harper and Brothers, he was then America's leading Black author and its most successful author. Even so, Harper and Brothers rejected the novel. And I want to address this question first to Malcolm. Malcolm, you have read the novel and the short story version, which was published in the 1940s in a much redacted form from the novel. And you have some real appreciation for the significant differences between the two versions, the novel and the short story. So I want to ask you, does it surprise you that this novel, powerful as it is, and as famous as your grandfather was at the time he wrote it, does it surprise you that it couldn't be published in his lifetime?
You're muted, Malcolm. Thanks. Yeah, I want to say no, that it doesn't surprise me, but then there is always the kind of candid, innocent part of me that is like, you know, regrettable, unfortunate stuff always surprises me to some degree. So, you know, I guess I'd have to time travel and, you know, be in the atmosphere, which I guess none of us here can really recollect in living memory, to really understand whether it was even possible or could have been considered that it be published as it was. But projecting myself into that space, I think it was very unlikely that there was any chance. Just the sort of really graphic depiction of what police officers routinely did to Black people, whether it was to extract a confession or simply, you know, in the course of fulfilling their duties, so to speak, you know, which in the Black community have always been viewed somewhat differently than to the mainstream. You know, going as far as considering them an occupying force in our communities sometimes, you know, that's how intense those feelings can be. Yeah, I don't think that anyone was really ready for that to be a mainstream conversation. And it just kind of speaks to the way we approach race relations in the country, except in these very exceptional moments where it really bursts onto the scene. It is one of those things which we tend to sweep under the carpet, or to minimize, or to be in denial about, and to consider that, you know, the problem isn't as bad as it is. And even though we all know extremely racist people, whether they're family members or someone who lives down the street, you know, a lot of people tend to just kind of brush it off and say, well, that's just crazy Uncle so-and-so. And that's been the way we've approached it for a long time. And I think it's part of the American ethos in general, which is to sort of look on the bright side, right? Positivism is a very strong thing in American culture, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does really hurt us when it comes to race relations. We don't want to look down that dark alley often.
So let me put a related question to you, Kevin. And I'm thinking now of Native Son and the problems that novel caused for Richard Wright, even before its publication. Book of the Month Club insisted that Richard Wright heavily redact that novel, taking out one scene entirely and toning down the language. And this is something that happened fairly late in the production process of that book, when it was in galleys. And Richard Wright did it. Reluctantly, he did it, but you know, in some sense, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. Book of the Month Club then had the power to catapult a book onto the New York Times bestseller list. But even in its redacted form, the novel still caused other problems for Richard Wright. Some critics attacked the novel for its graphic nature, for its crudeness. Maybe most memorably, James Baldwin in the essay Everybody's Protest novel. But I'm thinking of the different nature of the violence in Native Son versus that in The Man Who Lived Underground. In Native Son, Bigger Thomas, the protagonist, the anti-hero, inadvertently kills Mary Dalton, the daughter of his white employer, and then to cover his tracks also murders his black girlfriend. But in The Man Who Lived Underground, it's not black on white violence, and it's not black on black violence. It's white on black violence. Fred Daniels is not Bigger Thomas. He's completely innocent. And he's basically framed by these police. He's tortured. Kevin, is there something different about the fact that it's white on black violence, do you think, that made the novel unacceptable to Wright's publishers at the time? I mean, well, is that a conversation? Are we ready for this novel now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. First of all, thank you, John, and Library of America, and Malcolm, you look just like your grandfather, by the way. It's just I must say that, and certainly to the Center for Fiction for having me. Let me say this first and foremost. Richard Wright, without question, is the first Black literary figure that I ever fell in love with, and I would actually argue probably the single most important person that made me know that I could be a writer from the time I was 18 years old. I'm of the Generation X, that went to integrated schools, those of us born in the 60s and 70s in America. I got no Richard Wright growing up, no Black literature whatsoever, you know, nothing, not Native Son, not Black Boy, not Uncle Tom's Children, nothing, absolutely nothing. And so when I got to college and I discovered Native Son, which you're talking about, and Black Boy and all of his other works, which I read everything, I was blown away by the fact that he was the first writer of any race that I'd read in America. I absorbed. I've been reading and writing since I was a kid. I knew I wanted to be a writer since I was 11 years old when I discovered Hemingway, but he was the first writer that I felt so directly not only talked about racism in America, but also talked about the psychosis, the psychology, the pathology, the illness that racism is, very, very directly. And I feel that, you know, that's what he was exploring with Native Son. And in fact, we know that Richard Wright wrote Native Son because he said he was going to write a book after the response to Uncle Tom's Children, where folks are not just going to cry and be sympathetic. They're going to understand this is what racism does to Black people in this country, i.e. Bigger Thomas. And I believe with The Man Who Lived Underground, which was his follow-up novel, as you said, he wanted to go outward and not just focus on this is what it does to Black people, but this is literally how it happens to Black people. This is this Black man, Fred Daniels, who's falsely accused of this crime, this heinous crime, and he is beaten, literally beaten. I don't want to tell the story completely to folks who haven't read the book yet, but he's basically being told he has to confess, which he does. And then we know how he ends up underground. You know, he flees, which is a common motif, a common theme in Richard Wright's stories, because to be Black in America is to be in a constant state of terror. And was America ready for it then? No, because think about the context of it. We were literally coming off the Great Depression and this highly charged case called the Scottsboro Boys in the late 1930s, you know, where all these young Black boys were accused of course, raping a white woman, you know what I'm saying, which was actually false. And then we know we were in the middle of, think about it, he wrote The Man Who Lived Underground. You said it accurately, 1941, 1942. What was happening in the world? In America, World War II was happening. And America needed to keep this image of this place that was this bastion of democracy as it was fighting the Nazis and all these enemies of democracy. Meanwhile, while doing anything that it could to suppress any notions that it actually doesn't treat a segment of its population in a democratic fashion, specifically Black people, because the country was born on racism. That's what the founding fathers were. That's what Columbus was. That's what the Pilgrims were. That's what the segregations of Jim Crow folks that Richard Wright grew up in. He knew it intimately because he was born in 1908 in the American South. And as we know, South means south of the Canadian border because he saw it in the North and he saw it in the South, which is why he eventually moved to Europe because he's like, I can't deal with this any longer. So the notes from the Man Who Lived Underground actually is an accurate depiction of American racism and what it does to people of color in 1942 and in 2021, which is why the book is so relevant. Look at the theme he's dealing with there: police brutality, the racism of a force that's supposed to protect the community, but actually is harassing the community. All you gotta do is Google Andrew Brown, Daunte Wright, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, the list is endless. Literally, there's a direct correlation between 1942 and a fictional character in this book, Fred Daniels, and all these real life figures. And so Richard Wright actually wrote a book that was quite prophetic, but the publishing industry, which was also racist at that time, did not want to deal with the truth. That's why the book was suppressed. That's the truth.
Let me ask a follow-up question. I think I want to put this to both of you, Malcolm and Kevin. And let me back up and explain a little bit about maybe the structure of the novel, right? It's the novel's told in a number of chapters, and it's broken into three parts. Part one involves the above ground world, where we see Fred Daniels' work life, his family life. We see his arrest, his accusations leveled at him by the police. We see his arrest. We see he's beaten and tortured. And then part two takes us into the underground world where Fred Daniels flees into the sewers beneath this nameless city. And then in part three, he emerges again into the above ground world. And I'm saying this really for the benefit of our viewers, but this is the question I really want to ask: is the novel, the full-length novel, is this narrative better told as a full-length novel, or is it better as a short story? I mean, what have we gained by the restoration of all this material? The whole first third to create the novel, Richard Wright drops the whole first third to create the short story, rather. He cuts the whole first third of the novel, the above ground section. He compresses the middle part and he changes the ending of his novel. Is this a better novel or a better short story?
Who goes first?
Please, I defer to you, Malcolm.
All right, man. So, hey, I think with someone like Richard Wright, the answer is probably always on some level going to be give us the full picture, right? Just let's feel what the man was trying to do. And so I think my baseline would be to say, without looking at any other factors, including my own opinions, and that's very much, I guess, the approach of the Library of America, and part of your mission is to bring a fuller appreciation for a lot of works by these people that we all admire. So now bringing in the way I feel about the book, well, I had 30 years of living with the man who lived underground being the short story, and I loved it. It was my favorite thing that Richard Wright wrote. And that was before I started to have a bit more of a literary background in terms of understanding his canon. You know, it just struck me, I didn't know where he was in his life when he wrote it, and I didn't know anything about the problems with publication. It just struck a chord with me for a number of reasons, probably because it's one of his more universal books that sort of starts to touch upon themes that really should grip all of us and go to the core of what it is to be a human being. And so, yeah, that was really potent for me. But 30 years later, and this fuller picture comes out, and so naturally there was a little bit of trepidation that, you know, maybe the thing that I loved so much was going to be changed irreversibly, for better or for worse. But that change is always scary when it comes to your favorites. It's like when people decide to make a movie adaptation of something that you absolutely love. You kind of like, I can't wait to see it, and I don't want them to do this at the same time. When I read it, it took a little bit of time for me to adapt, but I was immediately grateful for this broader understanding. It's at this, you know, it's kind of like if you love the Lord of the Rings, you kind of wish that, you know, maybe there was a fourth book after the Return of the King, right? So that the story can continue. Well, here we get, you know, a book up at the front and a book a little bit at the end as well. And it's like, you know, it's a treat to have more in that sense. But then to go a little bit more specifically into why I do think that it is better. Uh, First of all, you can't really understand Fred Daniels in the book until you understand what happened to him before he went underground. It's and it takes knowing to know. You don't know what you don't know, and I didn't know that I was missing that until this was restored and we were able to read his manuscript and get into the restoration. And of course, you know, having that kind of run-in with the police, which is a visceral read, right? And for Black people, possibly especially, but people, I think, you know, a lot of people can relate to some form of abuse or excessive force at the hands of authorities, and so, you know, that there is more universalism there than we perhaps give credit for, and so that's a really visceral experience, and it puts you on Fred Daniels' side. Of course, we tend to be on the fugitive side when there's a fugitive in a story. We're like, yeah, I hope he escapes. But now we really want him to escape because we know what he's running from, and it's an experience that would break the best of us and the strongest of us. And, you know, I don't think that Fred Daniels has a particularly advanced amount of fortitude. You know, he's not someone he's not a Navy SEAL who's been trained to withstand torture, right? Far from it. He's just a simple human being who is going about his business and who doesn't really necessarily have, you know, a far-ranging a broad tool set with which to analyze the world. You feel that he's a fairly simple person. So that's really powerful. And then the ending, which I'll try not to spoil, the difference that comes in with the full-length story is there is an overarching broader force that comes into play at the end, which surpasses the might of the police, which up until that point are the highest authority in the book, and, you know, the powers that be, and the power that Fred Daniels is running from and is afraid of. And I think that's really, really important, especially because the United States still today, but at the time was even more isolationist. Now we're not isolationist, we're just perhaps a little sort of inward looking, navel gazing. But at the time, you know, to actually bring in a force that is sort of external to the United States of America, and to, you know, sound that note of caution that, you know, these people that are able to lord it over the powerless within the United States may also have their moment of reckoning of some sort, is a really, really important note to bring in. And it kind of foreshadows Richard Wright's internationalism and the next leg of his journey when he leaves the United States. He's going to broaden his scopes in all kinds of ways. And so, yeah, I feel like that's really important. So yes, we're resounding yes, it's a better it's a better story, complete.
I agree with Malcolm, because I think one of the things I thought about as Malcolm was speaking is that what happens when things are cut, rejected, we're talking about a story about a Black person, a Black male in this case, Fred Daniels. Once again, you're reducing the humanity of that person. You're making it a one-dimensional figure, like there's no context for it. I saw a question. I know we're supposed to be getting questions in a different form. Marcella asked, what were some of the influences? In my mind, I agree with Malcolm. If you please read his brilliant afterword, the afterword of Richard Wright's grandson, Malcolm, he talks about the connection to Plato and the allegory of people being in a cave. And if someone comes out of the cave, what they see. But the inverse happens with this book, where Fred Daniels goes into the cave to actually get sight. I mean, there's so many things that I thought about as I was reading. I think Malcolm's spot on about the connection between Plato, and he talks about how his grandfather had Plato's works in his library. I also think about slave narratives. I think about people escaping from slavery. And let's not forget, in America, in the context of American racism, the predecessor for police forces, like the ones that beat up and bullied Fred Daniels, were the slave patrols in this country. They were the predecessors for what became the police force. I think what were the influences of Richard Wright? America led to him writing this book. Again, he was born in 1908. He saw this country. He knew what lynchings looked like. He knew what chain gangs looked like. He began to realize, even when he migrated to the big cities to the north, that wait a minute, the racism is just as bad here as it is in the South. It may be different, but it's just as bad. And how dare you as Northerners make it look like the Southerners are somehow worse at it? Racism is racism. And I think that he drew upon all those influences. I mean, I feel the blues in this work. I feel, there's a kind of surrealism in the work. There's all these different things, because he was an incredibly well-read human being. And as we know, as we would discover when he puts out his memoir, Black Boy, in 1945, this is someone who had to lie to get a library card and pretend that he was getting books for a white person, because they would not let a Black person, a Black boy, get books. But he became self-taught. And all of that, I think one reason why Richard Wright said this was the most inspired book that he ever wrote is because it's almost like everything he had experienced up until that point just spilled out of him, including the great success, as you alluded to, John, of Native Son. And so absolutely, I think The Man Who Lived Underground is important. I didn't know it existed either until I got the notice about it. I was one of those folks, I literally read 8 Men, and I read the short story version of this, and I thought that was it. And so to have this discovery, and I do need to credit you all, John, and Library of America, because not only to go and painstakingly put this book together and go through the different iterations of the different notes in the archives of Richard Wright is really incredible, to try to stay true to what he really intended. And I think it's important what you all did to get this book out here, because I mean, who could have picked a better era than now to release a book like this? Honestly, it's an incredible tool for us, an incredible literary gift to the world, in my opinion.
Just want to add a thought to that, because you really inspired me saying that, Kevin. We have these mRNA vaccines that have been in development for over a decade, I believe. And they came to fruition, right when we needed them. We were ready because we had put that work in.
That's right.
Down the line. And I would liken LOA's approach and my mother finding the manuscripts.
Yes, your mother, Julia Wright. Yes.
Yeah, 10, 12 years ago, and realizing that this needed to surface, and then collaborating with LOA. I'm not likening it to the same, impact on public health, because the vaccines are really, really impacting everybody on the planet at this point, and helping us get out of a sore and difficult spot. But I want to liken it in terms of foresight, and that, that's the kind of far-ranging, looking into the future type of work that we need to do, because we never know what clock is ticking, and you got to start early if you want to make it for when that clock expires.
I mean, if I could just add really quickly, John, I think what you said, Malcolm, is so spot on because, you know, Malcolm X said that history is a people's memory, but I believe that literature, great art, is actually also our memory. And what has happened historically, books like this either are not published, they're suppressed, they're told that they're not important, they're not good enough. And it's a way of literally erasing aspects of American history, which is why you have people in 2021 still grappling with racism. Imagine if this book would have actually come out and the kind of conversations that would have been generated around it. You know, so I think that this is important to say because, you know, as much as I grew up loving Shakespeare and Chaucer and Keats and all the so-called classics, well, Richard Wright is classic too. And his work needs to be there right next to them.
Absolutely. We've been discussing The Man Who Lived Underground in terms of the novel's themes and its subject matter. And Kevin, you've alluded to this. There are other ways of talking about this novel, and I don't want to lose sight of them. There are aesthetic things that maybe we should talk about. Richard Wright saw his novel as a creative leap forward, as an innovative work in terms of its jazz-inflected prose. And especially its use of imagery. I'm thinking of all of the quick changing symbols and imagery, especially in that middle part of the novel. And I want to read just very quickly an excerpt from Wright's essay about his novel.
Yeah.
Here, in The Man Who Lived Underground, for the first time in my writing, I could burrow into places of American life where I'd never gone before and link that life organically with my basic theme. And not only link it, but link it in a way that carried, to my mind and feelings, an unmistakable relationship. All this leads me to speak of another element in writing which may not be derived or linked with its basic Negro form, jazz. So is this a jazz novel, Malcolm, Kevin?
That's a great question, John.
You go first, Kevin.
You said, is it a jazz novel? That's a great question. I think it is. I think it's a jazz novel. I think it's a blues novel. I think it's both of those things because one birthed the other. You know, there was blues and then there was jazz. But I think that, you know, it's funny you asked because when I first read Wright and going back and reading this now and thinking about the impact that he had on me, I mean, this is just a stunning piece of writing. And you're right about the images. I mean, just the first sentence where he says the big white door closed after him. I mean, I remember how he would use these colors in his writing, both Native Son and Black Boy in his short stories, you know, because he understood what color or colorism had done to him. And so it's almost like he was throwing it back out the world with these images, the big white door, because that symbolizes racism. We know what it is. We know what that means. And I think that Wright was someone who played with language. I think he played with images. I think that he was a master listener. And so he was able to capture the wordplay of people, the dialect of people. And I just think that, you know, he is, and it was said when we did the conversation with Jackson State with your mother a few weeks ago, Malcolm, that, you know, he was really the quintessential American writer more than anyone else, because the reality is, white brothers and sisters, white folks, unless you're very culturally competent and what we call in these times woke, you don't have to pay attention to Black people, Latinx people, Asian people, Native American people. But people of color have no choice to be confronted with whiteness every single day of our lives. And so not only do we know ourselves, but we also know you all oftentimes better than you know yourselves. And Wright, to me, including with The Man Who Lived Underground, is such a master storyteller in really capturing what it is that is America, the beauty of it, but also its incredible contradictions. And I think that's what makes this novel powerful. And I think, you know, Malcolm, you're right. And John, you're both right that, you know, out of all the stuff he wrote, this is the one where he really got to explore a whole range of things. Because also, I think one of the things he probably was grappling with, which is why he wrote this book, is because they were trying to put him in this box where you can only write about Black stuff and write about, you know, what happens to Black people. No, what if I want to flip it, not only talk about what happens to Black people, but let me talk about what y'all are doing as well, because I understand you all oftentimes better than you understand yourself. And I think that's the brilliance of Richard Wright. And there's very few American writers who can say they could do that the way Richard Wright did. That's just a reality.
Yeah, wow. So I want to both go to the jazz blues thing and then talk about what you just talked about, Kevin, because it's really, really important to get into that. So just really quickly, so for me, you know, jazz, I feel jazz throughout, especially the underground experience, because of the timelessness. You're kind of divorced from the chitter and chatter of life. And so the symbols can, you know, come in quick succession and give you all these kind of really vibrant inputs one after the other, and they're symbols more than they are kind of intellectually felt. You feel them viscerally, the way you would feel jazz and the changing moods of it, and the script can flip quite quickly, right? So there's this intensity of maybe a psychedelic trip that you can go through, you know, several lifetimes in an hour, because the timelessness and the lack of the light of day and just being closed in on yourself, all of those things amplify in the darkness and the silence of the underground. So yeah, I really feel like I'm listening to some mad jazz when I read through that portion, and I love it. I think it's really, really powerful. And of course, jazz is freedom, right? So Kevin was talking about how Wright, you can feel it. You can feel that he's, you know, he's spreading some wings here, and there's a freedom in his expression, and you really get the sense that he could take this anywhere. The next place that Fred Daniels digs through a wall, he could come upon anything, and the book could go anywhere, literally. And that's really exhilarating, I think, both for Richard as he was writing it and for us as readers. But Kevin, you're so spot on when you say that, you know, Richard was so much more than the race issue. And it's an amazing thing to be a person of your time as he was, being a pioneer in that sense, and also being accepted to the degree that he was accepted in the United States, and was able to raise those issues. You know, that's an accomplishment that, you know, he doesn't have very many peers for at the time. But then, you know, that's only half the picture, because, you know, we then discover that, you know, his peers were people like Jean-Paul Sartre and so and Simone de Beauvoir, and so you realize that this man is just, he's a man. He's not just a black man.
That's right.
He's a man in the sense that very few American authors were, period. I mean, how many American authors at the time were looking at the world as their playground, and looking at, you know, various cultures around the world and international politics as fodder for their writing and their thinking? I can't think of many.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's a really interesting metric of where we are today, because it's easy to look back at, you know, how flawed the 40s were, and, you know, how it came about that that book was censored. You know, today I can't help but notice that almost every time we talk about Richard Wright as an influential writer, I mean, actually every time I've seen this said, it is always said that he has influenced countless Black writers.
Right.
Now that's all good and well, and it's a fantastic thing that he has. Don't get me wrong, but frankly, I mean, the uniqueness of someone who was able to have this kind of stellar, kind of like a shooting star, from the South to the North to Europe to across the world to Indonesia and to Scandinavia, and to just be involved in so many things and be writing about so many things, that he should be inspiring everybody, and that is never said. And so that is part of the box that we are still in at this point in time. You know, the critics are not yet saying that, you know, that's the caliber of writer that we're looking at.
And we can say it, Richard Wright was not just a great writer, not a Black writer, a great writer, but he was a giant intellectually, and he was a global figure. You know, you think about him being at the Bandung conference in the 1950s. I think, Malcolm, you're alluding to that. I mean, this is someone who was clearly an internationalist. And, you know, I just, thank you, Malcolm. Just thank you for saying that, because I think part of it, you know, and I'm glad you said too, Malcolm, that the book was censored, because it was in fact censored. you know, and we can even argue that it was something that happened with his agent and the publishers, and, you know, it shut the book down. And thank goodness that Richard Wright was prolific and he was able to pivot to other things. You know, he still kept going, but imagine the devastation and the challenge that we still deal with in these times, because it's not like the publishing world by and large is significantly better in America than it was in 1942 when he went through what he went through. You know, we're still fighting to have our voices out there and to be respected. And it's a shame to me that we are still having some of the same conversations. What can a writer write if they happen to be Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, if they happen to be a woman, if they happen to be a member of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, if they happen to be disabled? You know, can they talk about poverty if they come from poverty? You know, we need to understand that the totality of the human race is making sure that every voice is heard equally and they're able to be full human beings. And that's what Richard Wright was fighting for, which is why I believe that he left the country a few years after what happened with this, in spite of the great successes of Native Son and Black Boy, because he wanted to be free and he felt he could not be free in America.
Yeah, I think that's right, and in some sense it was a kind of censorship. I think, you know, maybe not in the technical sense of that word, but I think the novel looked just too hot to handle for Wright's publishers. I also think that the novel did not fit Paul Reynolds, the agent, and his editor, Edward Aswell's own limited understanding of what a Richard Wright novel looked like. All right, the example that they had in front of them was Native Son, which is this huge bestseller for Harper and Brothers. It sells 215,000 copies in the first 3 weeks of its life. And these two men are looking for another Native Son. They're looking for another big fat work of literary naturalism. And what they get instead, what lands on their desk instead, is this short Kafkaesque novel about a man who flees from the police and takes up this bizarre existence in the sewers of an unnamed city. I think they just did not recognize that as a Richard Wright novel. But we have this novel now, and I think it does, in a fundamental way, it makes the thread clearer from Native Son to The Man Who Lived Underground to The Outsider, and those are the three important works of fiction. I think I want to read something, and I'd like each of you to respond to this. It's just a brief excerpt, and it comes from the middle chapters, which is to say the underground section of the novel. And here Fred Daniels has tunneled into yet another basement. And he's tunneled, this time he has tunneled into a jewelry shop, and he is spying on this night watchman who's asleep on a cot. And Wright uses the words invisible man as a metaphor when he's talking about Fred Daniels, to mean both Daniels' invisibility to those above ground, but also his ability to spy on others without being seen. So it's very brief, but let me read this. So the watchman is laying on the cot. This poor night watchman's job was to kill or lay down his life, protect those rings and diamonds and watches. And I'm going to skip a little bit here. He was filled with reflection, experiencing again that high pitch of consciousness, gazing like an invisible man hovering in space upon the life that lived above ground in the darkness of the sun. Now, when I read that, I can't but help think of Ralph Ellison.
Yep.
And when the critic Stanley Hyman suggested that Ellison had been influenced by Wright's short story, The Man Who Lived Underground, Ellison scoffed at the idea. He said, I was influenced by Dostoevsky and Dostoevsky's narrator in the notes from the Underground, but not by but not by Fred Daniels. Put that way, I agree with it, but still, wasn't he influenced in other ways by this novel? We know that he read the short story. We know that he read the excerpts in Accent magazine of the novel that were published in 1942. Am I right in seeing the influence? Is it there?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, otherness is, I'll just jump in real quick, but I think that maybe Kevin will have more to say. Otherness is at the core of what it is to be African American in the United States, and that duality of vision that Kevin was talking about, whereby, you know, we know ourselves, and we are forced as a matter of survival to intimately know the dominant culture as well, and to read every fluctuation, because, you know, not gauging the winds correctly for a very long time could end you up in a really dangerous situation. So there's almost this sort of electrical tension of reading, you know, what is going on with white folks. And I think that maybe, you know, that's mirrored in how he's talking about the sort of vibrant tension of observing this watchman. At least that's how I felt it. So otherness is so pervasive in Richard Wright's work that I think that his reading of Ellison would have been really potent, and he would have been like, yeah, this is what I'm getting at. This is a metaphor for everything I write all the time, you know, like, because we have been historically invisible, right? So that's a given. And that was also a survival tool. The less you're noticed, the less trouble you can get into. And so, you know, as a type of a survival mechanism, you make yourself self-effacing. You make yourself as agreeable as possible. Oh yes, sir. Oh no, sir. You know, and that has been a part of Blackness, the Black experience until modern times. And when you face a police officer, it's exactly like it was in the old times. You are completely obsequiously as non-threatening as possible, knowing that you still might get killed. So that goes to the core of our experience. It goes to the core of a lot of what Richard Wright wrote. And then, of course, The Outsider is called The Outsider, and it really, really hammers home, you know, what it means to be outside society in that sense, and to watch things transpire and understand things from a distance and a perspective outside of life. And The Outsider, he's believed to be dead. And the theme of the Undertaker, you know, which is pervasive in Richard Wright's work as well, you know, is again, you know, that sort of basement. You're outside of life. You're seeing the living come to you as corpses. You're in the netherworld almost. You know, you're outside of life in that sense. But you can clinically, anatomically see what people are made up of. You know, there's some interesting kind of strands of meaning there. So for me, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I want to respond to it, but I just need to say this, Malcolm and John, because I think it's important as an artist myself, and Malcolm's an artist as well, a great filmmaker and writer himself. You know, censorship is not just outright someone saying no to someone. I'm not going to put your film out, or your dance piece, or your painting, or your book. Censorship is also not supporting the full humanity of that person who's creating that content. That's what censorship is as well. And so I think it's important because, you know, when we grow up in America, people tell us what words mean. One of the things I'm really glad of, because I've read Richard Wright since I was 18 years old, so for 30 plus years, I realized I needed to find the words for myself, because that's what he taught me. And that's what censorship actually means. It means that this lukewarm response, hoping that you actually go away, you know, because I don't want to deal with the truth of what you're putting in front of me right now. And what was he putting in front of people? It was a critique of America and racism in the middle of World War II. So we need to be very clear about that. Number two, of course, I thought of Ralph Ellison, and there's no way You know, if we can call Richard Wright for a second the premier Black writer in America at that time, that means that everyone who wanted to be a writer, who happened to be Black, white, otherwise, was reading Richard Wright. And that certainly included Ralph Ellison, who we actually knew. You know, I mean, they came up, you know, they're not that much different, many years apart. So there's no way that Ellison wasn't impacted, you know, and it's right in there as you read it, John. When he uses the term invisible man, when I read that, I was like, wow, Ellison got it from here, you know. And I think it's also interesting. It says a lot about the internalized racism or self-hatred of Black people, where we'll acknowledge the, you know, we'll say, well, Dostoevsky influenced me, but we won't even acknowledge the contribution of Richard Wright, which I think is absolutely insane, but a byproduct of internalized racism, to be honest with you. And then I think the last thing I'll say is, you know, we need to also acknowledge that there was this phenomenon in the 1940s called detective stories, these crime novels that were happening. And you can see the impact that as well. You asked about influences earlier and some of the techniques there. That's certainly a part of this because, you know, as you all said in here, you know, there was a real life story that happened in Los Angeles, you know, and Richard Wright was a voracious reader of the news, of books, of everything. And so all of that made its way into it, because if you get to use your full humanity as a writer, as an artist, as a creative content, that means that all of it is going to find its way into your art. And for whatever reasons, again, they did not want this because they actually did not want his full humanity as a person who happened to be of African descent, which is why it got censored. And that's why it's a blessing that it's being put out all these years later, thanks to Julia Wright, his daughter, Malcolm's mother, and Library of America. We appreciate y'all for that.
We're getting toward the end of time. I don't know if we've really answered questions that have been coming in through the chat. Do we need to turn to those now, or should we wrap things up? You know, there's one last question I'd like to put to you. We've been getting reviews for this book since its publication. Well, now exactly 1 week ago. It was published last Tuesday, and the reviews, I think, for the most part, have been really quite terrific. And it's interesting to see the way that readers and reviewers have been responding. Reviewing The Man Who Lived Underground in the Wall Street Journal, Clifford Thompson, in a truly excellent piece, raised the question whether or not this might in fact be Richard Wright's most accomplished novel. And he says, whether or not The Man Who Lived Underground is Wright's single finest work, whether or not The Man Who Lived Underground is Wright's single finest work, it must be counted as his most significant. Malcolm, is this your grandfather's best novel, or, and you have to see this in scare quotes, or is it merely his most significant novel?
I think both, and I can say that without reservation, and I already felt that before I knew the full text that we now have in the restored edition. And I think I can answer one of the questions in the Q&A at the same time as answering this question. Courtney is asking how we might be able to use this book as a tool so that 70 years down the line, we're not still dealing with the same problems with racism in America. And I think that not only can we use it as a tool, and we can get into how, but that's potentially the biggest value that it brings to the table. Richard was at this amazing fertile moment in his life when he was about to make the biggest leap into the unknown that he had made to date, and perhaps the biggest he would ever make, because once you've left your homeland to foreign lands, you then can replicate that, and it may not be as daunting each time afterwards. You've done it once, you've experienced people speaking another language around you. The first time you do that, that's pretty daunting. He was looking down the barrel at that moment in time of, can I live here as an author? Can I create here? Can I become what I need to become here? Of course, the answer was no. Can I raise a daughter here and feel that her dignity will be respected? Of course, the answer was, there are probably places where my daughter will be viewed as more of a complete human being than here. And so with all of these things swirling around in his mind, and we should draw a parallel absolutely to what is swirling around in our minds today and in the minds of our youth. And we want to pass on the best education to empower them and see themselves as all that they can be. Those questions go directly to that. And so the freedom that this character, Fred Daniels, has fleeing into the underground, saying, actually, this stuff that's being foisted upon me by the outside world, you know, this dark sewer is actually less scary to me, and the
That's right.
freedom that it offers is actually a warmer embrace than the light of the sun itself. Um, is really a powerful message, and something that we could, you know, we could talk about endlessly with students, you know, and say, look, you know, what kind of leaps are you going to make in your lives? And it's not just Black people, right? As a country, we can be so much more. We can be so much more involved in world affairs and cognizant of world affairs, and understanding of other cultures, and just, you know, just more intellectually curious in general, right? And that's how we're going to grow and come into our own. And racism dies a natural death. You know, it's like exposing bacteria and viruses to the sunlight. It just dies a natural death when you expose people to other ways of being, and their ignorance shrinks, right? And as it shrinks, they watch it shrinking and they realize, hey, I thought I knew everything yesterday, and I realize I didn't. What do I not know today that I still think I know? And the more that happens, the more you're like, actually, you know what? I just have to keep an open mind, because I continuously realize that how limited I am. We haven't really started that journey. We still are the end all be all, the alpha, the omega of everything in the United States. That's how we view ourselves. And so Richard, at the moment where he was going to take that leap, if we could leap with him and start traveling the world the way he did, and start reading the other things that he wrote about the world, and realize that someone was doing this in the 1940s and 1950s, and we just haven't paid attention to what he wrote after he left, basically, in the United States. He kind of fell off a cliff. He's not writing about the US anymore. Okay, we're not going to pay attention. So that, if we use this book as that tool, as a bridge to all of those sorts of explorations, then I think that not only will we be combating racism, but we will be growing into a bigger potential for Americans in general, and have a better place in the world. And finally, we will also stop being mocked by other countries for being so insular and just not understanding what goes on elsewhere.
Let me say this. I mean, Malcolm's spot on, and I loved everything you said, because you're right. You know, Richard Wright never fell off. To me, his work was important right to the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, James Baldwin, yep, he wrote that essay that was terrible and dissed Richard Wright. But after Mr. Wright died, he realized the error of his ways, and he actually apologized basically in a piece about it, because he realized that was such a terrible mistake to trash a writer like that, you know, because Richard Wright had a huge impact on him. In fact, we know Notes of a Native Son comes from Richard Wright. Malcolm said it all, but, you know, to me, if there's one sentence that sums up the man who lived underground, you have to sometimes get uncomfortable and go places you've never been before, including underground, to actually find yourself. That is the problem with our country, America, and the world. Most people are comfortable where they are and not willing to get out of those comfort zones. And I believe that Richard Wright, particularly with this book, The Man Who Lived Underground, predicted the civil rights movement, Black Power, the birth and rise of hip hop, because the things that he's saying in this book are actually the same things that NWA said in a song called F the Police in 1989. The exact same things, the same things that Public Enemy said, same things that Tupac Shakur said. If you don't think so, read this book and listen to the lyrics of hip hop. Because for once we had a culture where we were not being censored, because we created it and we just put it out there. And we know that The Man Who Lived Underground predicted Black Lives Matter and the whole notion of defund the police, because he's talking about the same exact thing in 1942 that we're dealing with in 2021, you know. And let's not forget, it's not just the police, but Richard Wright grew up in a world where there were people, Black bodies hanging from trees. And here we are now bracing ourselves every week in America for yet another Black body to be destroyed, you know, because they're Black. And so I think that Malcolm is right. You know, racism and sexism and all the systems of oppression and hate and discrimination, all of it will not end unless people are willing to do the work and confront things that may make them uncomfortable. And finally, we have a book, a useful tool, and a great work of art that I think people need to read and spread around everywhere and say, look what was said here. and we're still dealing with it. Let's end this here so it's not passed from generation to generation. That's the saga of America. And tragically, and sadly, I should say, Richard Wright had to leave America because he didn't feel safe and free here. And that's sad because he, at the end of the day, y'all, was a native son of America.
I think eloquently put, both of you, and that's, you know, that's a terrific place to end. Kevin, maybe I want to ask you the single most, his single finest work, or merely his most significant novel. Single finest or merely most significant work.
I mean, I love this book. I think it's incredibly important. I'm glad that y'all did it. Thank you, Library of America. Thank you, Julia Wright. Thank you, Julia Wright. Thank you, Julia Wright. Thank you, Malcolm Wright. This one, and for me, this one and Black Boy, because Black Boy, I'm trying not to get emotional. Black Boy changed my life. Black Boy is where I saw that a Black boy could be a writer. That's all I can say. And that's why I have 14 books, because of Richard Wright. That's the truth.
That's great, man.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, the Center for Fiction. Melanie, is there anything that we need to do now?
No, I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, John. Thank you, Library of America, for putting this book out. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation. We will post the video of it in a couple of weeks on our website, so you can feel free to share it freely with people that you want to experience it as well. And with that, I'll say good night to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Center for Fiction.
Right.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.